when reality becomes a battlefield of illusions. Have you ever wondered why, despite all our technological advances and social movements, the world seems to be spiraling deeper into chaos? We witness economic upheaval in America, student protests erupting from Indonesia to France, Gen Z in Nepal taking to the streets, and a collective sense that something fundamental is breaking down everywhere we look. The conventional wisdom tells us to look outward, blame the politicians, fix the systems, fight the injustices. But what if we've been looking in entirely the wrong direction? We live in an age where every form of disorder seems to manifest simultaneously, from the economic volatility that keeps American families awake at night, to the social inequalities that fueled protests from Paris to Jakarta, to the environmental crises that threaten our very survival. The media, analysts, and politicians consistently point to external causes: failed policies, corruption, wars, or the decay of traditional moral structures. Yet all these manifestations, however distinct and systemic they may appear, are merely the surface symptoms of a much deeper root, a crisis within human consciousness itself. The fundamental question we must ask ourselves is this: if the source of our collective turmoil lies not in our external circumstances, but in the very way we perceive and interact with reality, then how can any external solution truly address what we're experiencing? This isn't about abandoning our responsibility to the world, but about recognizing that the world we see is a direct reflection of the consciousness that observes it. What we're about to explore together challenges everything we've been conditioned to believe about change, progress, and the nature of human problems. We'll discover that the crisis we face isn't political, economic, or even environmental at its core. It's a crisis of perception, a fundamental distortion in how consciousness relates to itself and the world it creates. This journey will reveal why every external revolution has ultimately failed to bring lasting peace, and why the most profound transformation begins not with changing the world, but with understanding the mind that perceives it. The fragmentation of modern consciousness, we have never learned to look inward as a root cause. Consciousness, the very foundation that creates all thought, emotion, and action, has been neglected as if it were irrelevant to our collective predicament. Yet without human consciousness, there would be no society, no economy, no culture. The world is merely a mirror reflecting the collective inner state of humanity, and that mirror is shattering before our eyes. The crisis in consciousness is not simply individual psychological disorder. It represents a fundamental deviation in how humans perceive reality, in the relationship between I and the world. The modern mind has been conditioned to fragment, separate, and identify itself with images. I am this body, this name, this nationality, this title, these beliefs. The I becomes trapped within an illusion of selfhood, operating through fear and ambition, craving control and protection. From this foundation, all human life becomes a chain of reactions, an existence perpetually in conflict. Consider how this plays out in the protests we see across the globe. Whether it's Gen Z in Nepal demanding political reform, students in Indonesia fighting corruption, or the Block Everything movement in France, each uprising carries within it the same fundamental pattern. The protesters, however justified their cause, operate from a consciousness that sees the world as something external to be fought against, changed, or controlled. They identify themselves as separate from what they oppose, creating the very division they seek to heal. This is not to dismiss the validity of their concerns or the necessity of their actions within the current paradigm. Rather, It's to point out that as long as the motivation springs from a consciousness trapped in the illusion of separation, every revolution becomes merely another rotation of the same wheel of conflict. The oppressed become the oppressors, the revolutionaries become the new establishment, and the fundamental pattern of division continues. We have learned to view the world as something external that needs to be improved, changed, or fought against. But this only feeds the division further. Every battle for justice, if it originates from a mind not yet free from fear and resistance, becomes merely another version of violence wrapped in palatable language. True change cannot come from patching up old structures, but from completely dismantling the old perceptual framework, a framework programmed by desire, comparison, and ego. The American dream itself exemplifies this consciousness perfectly. Built on the premise of individual achievement, competition, and the accumulation of external markers of success, it creates a society of isolated individuals constantly measuring themselves against others. The resulting anxiety, depression, and social fragmentation we see across American communities is not a failure of the system. It is the system working exactly as designed by a consciousness rooted in separation. When humans have not clearly seen the operational structure of their own minds, all external efforts become circular. We can change governments, education systems, and technologies, but if the motivation still springs from ego consciousness, the new becomes merely a different copy of the old. This is not a call to turn away from the world, but a reminder that the world begins from within. The most profound revolution does not begin with guns or banners, but with silence. Not the silence of escape, but the silence of complete awareness, where the mind ceases all internal conflict. In that silence, unconditioned intelligence, intelligence that belongs to no individual, but is the free light that emerges when the ego falls silent, can operate. From that place, all action becomes harmonious with the whole, no longer arising from the division between person and person, between humanity and nature. The conditioning runs so deep that we mistake our thoughts for reality, our emotions for truth, our beliefs for facts. We live in a constant state of psychological time, always becoming, always moving towards some future state of fulfillment or away from some feared outcome. This movement itself is the source of conflict because it creates a gap between what is and what should be, between the observer and the observed. Watch how this manifests in the global protests. The students in Indonesia are not just fighting corruption. They're fighting their own sense of powerlessness projected onto external authority. The French protesters blocking everything are not just resisting economic policies. They are resisting their own feeling of being trapped in a system that doesn't recognize their humanity. The Nepalese youth are not just demanding political change. They're demanding recognition of their own worth and dignity. But here lies the paradox. The very act of demanding, fighting, and resisting from a consciousness that feels separate and threatened only perpetuates the cycle of conflict. The external world responds to internal division with more division. The system pushes back because it is being pushed against. The revolution becomes just another turn of the wheel of violence, however noble its intentions. This is why every external revolution in human history has ultimately failed to bring lasting peace and harmony. The French Revolution led to the terror and then to Napoleon. The Russian Revolution led to Stalin. The American Revolution, despite its noble ideals, led to a society built on the genocide of indigenous peoples and the enslavement of Africans. Not because the revolutionaries were evil, but because they operated from the same consciousness of separation that created the problems they sought to solve. If there is a real crisis occurring, it does not lie in the economy or political systems. It lies in the very way we think, feel, and exist. And if there is a solution, it cannot come from any system that has been constructed by a consciousness still caught in illusion. The solution does not come from accumulating more knowledge, but from liberation from old knowledge. Not from doing more, but from seeing more clearly. Practical applications. Observing the mechanism of attachment and resistance. During the first week of this exploration, begin by simply watching your own mind's tendency to identify with positions, beliefs, and reactions. When you read news about protests, political conflicts, or social issues, notice immediately how your consciousness takes sides. Don't try to change this reaction. Simply observe it with the same neutral attention you might give to watching clouds pass in the sky. Pay particular attention to the physical sensations that accompany your mental positions. When you read about corruption in government, notice if your body tenses. When you see images of protesters being confronted by police, observe whether your breathing changes. When you encounter opinions that contradict your beliefs, watch for the subtle contraction in your chest or the slight clenching of your jaw. These physical responses reveal how deeply the mind-body system is invested in maintaining its positions and defending its territory. The key insight during this first week is recognizing that what you call your opinions and reactions are not really yours at all. They're conditioned responses programmed by culture, family, education, and media. You're not thinking your thoughts are thinking you. This recognition begins to create a small gap between awareness and the automatic reactions of the conditioned mind. Practicing non-reactive awareness. In the second week, extend this observation to your daily interactions and responses to immediate circumstances. When someone cuts you off in traffic, when your boss makes an unreasonable demand, when your partner says something that triggers irritation, use these moments as opportunities to practice non-reactive awareness. Instead of immediately jumping into the familiar pattern of judgment, justification, or emotional reaction, pause and simply observe what is happening in consciousness. This doesn't mean becoming passive or suppressing your responses. Rather, it means creating enough space between stimulus and response to see the mechanism clearly. Notice how quickly the mind creates stories about other people's motivations, how it immediately categorizes experiences as good or bad, right or wrong, fair or unfair. Watch how it constantly compares present situations to past experiences and projects future scenarios based on current circumstances. During this phase, you might begin to notice something remarkable. The same consciousness that gets upset about personal slights is the same consciousness that gets upset about global injustices. The same mental mechanism that creates conflict in your personal relationships is the same mechanism that creates conflict in society. The scale is different, but the fundamental pattern is identical. Discovering the observer beyond the observed. After 2 weeks of basic observation practice, begin to investigate the nature of the observer itself. Who or what is aware of your thoughts, emotions, and reactions? This inquiry is not intellectual. It's a direct looking into the nature of consciousness itself. When you notice yourself getting caught in a mental pattern, instead of focusing on the content of the pattern, turn your attention to what is aware of the pattern. This practice often reveals a startling discovery. The awareness that observes your thoughts is not itself a thought. The consciousness that witnesses your emotions is not itself emotional. There is something in you that remains untouched by the constant fluctuations of mental and emotional states. This discovery is not a concept to be understood intellectually, but a direct recognition that can only be verified through your own investigation. As this recognition stabilizes, You may begin to notice that the same awareness that observes your internal states is also aware of the external world. The consciousness that knows your thoughts is the same consciousness that perceives the trees, the sky, other people, and global events. This recognition begins to dissolve the artificial boundary between inner and outer, between self and world. Engaging the world from wholeness. In the third and fourth weeks, begin to experiment with engaging worldly affairs from this recognition of wholeness, rather than from the position of a separate self, trying to fix or change things. This doesn't mean becoming inactive or indifferent. Instead, it means allowing action to arise from a deeper intelligence that sees the interconnectedness of all phenomena rather than from the ego's agenda of control and improvement. When you encounter news of social injustice, environmental destruction, or political corruption, notice if it's possible to respond from compassion rather than from anger or fear. Compassion here doesn't mean a sentimental emotion, but a clear seeing that recognizes the suffering inherent in unconscious behavior, both in those who perpetrate harm and in those who suffer from it. This compassion naturally gives rise to appropriate action, but action that doesn't add more division to an already divided world. You might find yourself drawn to participate in community activities, environmental initiatives, or social causes. But your participation will have a different quality. Instead of fighting against something, you'll be working for something. Instead of trying to defeat enemies, you'll be trying to heal wounds. Instead of adding your voice to the cacophony of outrage and blame, you'll be contributing to the emergence of solutions that address root causes rather than just symptoms. This shift in the quality of engagement often produces more effective results with less personal stress and burnout. When action arises from wholeness rather than from fragmentation, it carries a different energy, one that tends to inspire and unite rather than polarize and divide, living the revolution of consciousness. The final phase of this practice involves recognizing that the revolution of consciousness is not something you do, but something you are. Every moment of clear seeing, every instant of non-reactive awareness, every response that comes from wholeness rather than separation contributes to the transformation of collective consciousness. You are not separate from the world you seek to heal. You are an integral part of it, and your inner transformation is inseparable from outer transformation. This doesn't mean retreating from worldly engagement, but engaging from a fundamentally different foundation. When consciousness is no longer trapped in the illusion of separation, action becomes effortless and appropriate. You respond to what needs attention without the burden of trying to control outcomes. You contribute to solutions without the exhaustion of fighting against problems. You participate in the healing of the world by embodying the wholeness that the world seeks. The most radical thing you can do in a world gone mad with division is to discover the undivided nature of consciousness itself. This discovery is not a personal achievement or a spiritual attainment. It's simply a recognition of what has always been true. When this recognition stabilizes, you become a living demonstration that another way of being is possible. And this demonstration ripples out into the collective consciousness of humanity in ways that cannot be measured, but can certainly be felt. The end of the seeker and the sought. Seeing clearly is not done with physical eyes, but with a gaze that doesn't pass through the lens of ego identity. When this occurs, the world doesn't need to be saved, because there is no longer anyone separate to save the world. Only pure presence remains, with no division between the observer and the observed. And in that moment, the crisis dissolves, not because it has been solved, but because the one who saw it is no longer the same person as before. This is not mystical poetry, but a practical reality available to anyone willing to question the fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and identity. The crisis in the world is real, but it is not ultimately a crisis of politics, economics, or environment. It is a crisis of perception, and perception can be transformed in an instant when the mind that perceives recognizes its own true nature. The revolution we need is not in the streets, though the streets may be where its effects are felt. The revolution we need is in consciousness itself. And this revolution begins the moment you stop looking for yourself in your thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and identities, and start recognizing the awareness in which all of these phenomena appear and disappear. This recognition changes everything while changing nothing. The world continues to function, problems still need practical solutions, and life goes on. But the one who engages with all of this is no longer trapped in the illusion of separation that created the problems in the first place. From this freedom, truly creative solutions become possible. Solutions that heal rather than harm, that unite rather than divide, that address causes rather than just symptoms. The invitation is simple. Stop trying to fix the world and start investigating the consciousness that perceives a broken world. In that investigation, you may discover that the world was never broken, only the lens through which it was being seen. And when the lens is cleaned, reality reveals itself as it has always been, whole, complete, and perfect in its apparent imperfection.